we aren't meant to know everything. And in one day, you know, when we're with him for eternity, he can reveal those things to us. But I think in Proverbs it says something, the glory of man is to reveal things, but the glory of God is to keep things hidden. Something like that. Yeah. I have found peace and freedom in acknowledging that there's some things that I just don't know, and I'll be okay with that. And at some point he'll answer that.
You're not a good person. Pastor Miles Langrock.
Dr. Brian Jenkins.
How you doing, man?
I'm doing
other than that horrific story you just told off air.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah.
I like your shirt today.
Thank you. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Music in Fairhope, Alabama. Greatest music store on the planet.
Yeah.
Give a shout out to Wade and the team there at Dr. Music. I want to give a shout out to them.
They sell records and vinyls and
stuff. They sell vinyls. They sell tapes, CDs, great merch. It's where I got my, a friend of mine bought me a great koozie that says Fairhope, a sunny place for shady people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. So if you're ever in the Gulf Coast, you're ever out there visiting the beautiful Gulf Coast of Alabama, make sure you go by Fairhope, Alabama and check out Dr. Music.
Are you
Make sure you go to the downtown store, though, not the repair shop that's out on the state highway.
Are you a vinyl guy?
No, I'm made primarily of carbon. I'm a carbon-based life form. So
my question is whether or not you like
I enjoy vinyl. Yeah, I don't have like a lot. Like I'm not like an audiophile like that. Like my daughters are actually. They're both have quite a bit of records. Sophia, the producer, has like a really nice whole record player setup. I do, but I appreciate a good vinyl record. I actually have an original 1977 vinyl Star Wars soundtrack.
Oh, cool.
Not in the packaging, but still everything there. And there's a sheet inside of it that you could fill out and order for a free T-shirt, free Star Wars T-shirt. So
right on.
Yeah, pretty cool stuff.
I think I bought my dad a Cake Fashion Nugget vinyl recently.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
The band
not
Cake.
A cake. Yeah, not
the band Cake.
Yeah.
Their album Fashion Nugget.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right. I thought it was a cake that looked like a record.
Like a nugget? Is it because
I lost a lot of momentum on that conversation. I'm not going to lie to you. So.
All right. Well, we are in our third season.
What could possibly go wrong today?
We're in our third season.
I'm a little under the weather, as you can tell, probably from my voice. So
I couldn't tell.
Yeah.
Well, it makes it raspy. It's nice.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're gonna do that. Third season, talking about doctrines, talking about kind of questions that people have. We're talking about. There's core beliefs. What do Christians really believe? But then there's some other stuff. They're just general interest questions. Sometimes they're a barrier to faith. Sometimes they're just more curiosity. So this season, from time to time, we will deal with some of those things. And so that's kind of what we've cooked up for today.
Yeah. This episode asking the question, what happened to miracles? We read our Bible, and it seems like every other page there's a miracle. Something miraculous is happening. And oftentimes, you mentioned barrier to faith. Like oftentimes, that's the thing. Those are the things that people look at like, wow, did that really happen?
Right.
Maybe that's like an allegory, or maybe that didn't mean like exactly like the Red Sea didn't like actually.
Yeah,
split,
maybe there wasn't a flood, a worldwide flood. There was a flood in that area.
Yeah, it just got really.
Or it's that great line from Evan Almighty, not Bruce Almighty, but Evan Almighty. When she says, maybe it was a flood of understanding.
It's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, but people, people do that. So in order to, believe that the Bible is true, there's a lot of things that come along with that, like miracles.
Yeah.
So, okay, if we were to take the Bible and say, okay, I believe in it. I believe that these miracles did happen. Well, why are they happening today? So what's happened with all the miracles?
When you are a Bible college student, like in residence, going to Bible college, living at the seminary, whatever, as in all colleges, you have these late night conversations about philosophy or, the theories that you're studying. So what are the go-to questions that if you want to sound really like theologically in tune or theologically erudite, like if you really want to sound like, I want to ask a provocative question. A go-to question is always, why don't we see more miracles? And then you could just really derail the whole theology class for the day. But it is a sincere question, a lot of like how you said it, which is when I compare the reality in which I live and the reality in which it seemed that the people in the Bible lived, there seems to be this great discrepancy. What happened to that? So I think it is a legitimate question because I think it helps us understand both the nature of how God works in our world today and what God was doing in the Bible and in the stories of the Bible. So I think the best place to start is always, well, what is a miracle? What defines a miracle, right? People use that all over. You know, one of the most famous sports calls in all of history, Al Michaels, the Olympics, the USA beats the Soviet Union, and what does he say? Do you believe in miracles? Right? People throw the word miracle around all the time. A miracle of science, a miracle of technology, which actually can't be a thing. But so there's a couple of different ways of looking at miracles. And I think one thing that's important to understand about a miracle, so we're going to use Augustus Strong is an old-time commentator, but I really liked it. He says, it's an event palpable or measurable. In other words, it's an observable, measurable, quantifiable event to the senses produced for a religious purpose by the immediate agency of God. So put a pin in that point right there. And an event, therefore, which, though not contravening any law of nature, the laws of nature are fully known, would not, without this agency of God, be competent to explain. That's a whole lot there. But essentially, it is a moment that we can see, that we can hear, that we can feel, that we can experience, that seems to sit outside the standard cause and effect flow of the laws of nature. And so it's observable. They are sensory events. We can sense, we can experience in them. And why? So you have a miracle that's done. And then this other idea is it's an event which the only cause could be God. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Most events in the natural world are a sequence of cause and effect, right? So even events that seem random, natural events that seem random still have some sort of, this plus this equals this. And, the old butterfly flaps its wings in China. We have a hurricane in Florida. It's that whole sort of thing. The idea behind a miracle, one of the ways that theologians explain miracles is that they are events whose first cause is not the ongoing sequence of cause and effect chain, whose cause is God himself. So they're natural in that they are caused within the natural world, but they are miraculous, they are special, they are spontaneous in that the only cause is God himself, and they don't fit within the natural observable sequence. Wayne Grudem says we can define a miracle as follows. It's a less common kind of God's activity in which he raises people's awe and wonder and bears witness to himself. The definition takes into account our previous understanding of providence, where God preserves, controls, and governs all things. If we understand providence in this way, then we can understand miracles in this way. And so that really gets into the sense of when I say what a true miracle is, it's an event that is observable, that is seeable, that is experienced, but whose only cause could be God, and whose only immediate cause could be God. And so that is sort of the pure definition of a miracle.
So if God's intervening, right, his divine intervention, he's crossing time and space, or however he enters into our world, and he's intervening. Why? What is the purpose of the miracle? Why does he choose to do it? This time, maybe that's a separate question, but he chooses to do it here, but he chooses not to here.
Yeah.
So what's the purpose?
I think a really fascinating example of this is in the book of Acts, where Peter and John go through the temple court and they go through the gate Beautiful, which is one of the gates.
Yep.
And they see there a man born blind, right? Oh no, I'm sorry. He's a layman. He can't walk.
Yep.
He's paralyzed. But they go through there. And this is a place where Jesus himself would have walked many times. Even within the last month and a half, Jesus would have walked through here because we know that that's where he would have been. So Jesus passed by this man who obviously needed healing multiple times, probably. It's reasonable, although it's not explicit, but it's reasonable to assume. But Peter and John are the ones, and he says, "Sir, do you have any money?" And that's Peter's famous statement, "Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I thee. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise up and walk." So that's a perfect example in a lot of ways of why a miracle then, but not a miracle when Jesus himself could have done it.
Yeah.
And that really sort of inserts that point. Even like the man who's healed in John, I want to say John 4, but I'm probably wrong. John 5. In John 5, at the pool of Bethesda, where the man has to crawl down to the pool in order to touch it and to be healed. Why are all these other people getting healed, but not this person? And then of all the people in that court, why does Jesus pick that guy versus all the other people who could have been healed? So looking at the why of miracles, I think, is more critical even than understanding what a miracle is. But I think the idea of saying, what purpose does a miracle serve? And this is a really kind of an intellectual, theological conversation. It's not necessarily an emotionally satisfying one. So I tell people a lot of times, I can either give you an emotionally satisfying answer or I can give you a theologically satisfying answer, but I can rarely give you both at the same time, okay? But if you look at Scripture, so if we use Scripture as our guide, the overwhelming reason that God does miracles is to draw attention to His power, His glory, His love, and His compassion.
Yeah.
He does miracles to draw people to Him. And so there is an implication in the miracles that there's almost what I almost call an economy of miracles. In other words, which is the miracle in the moment that would maximize, that would draw the proper amount of attention to God. They inspire, hopefully then a miracle should also, out of that attention, it should inspire those key aspects of worship, awe, gratitude, and love or reverence. And so the miracles that we have in the Bible consistently, it says, you look through the Old Testament miracles, I do this so that they will know that there is a God in heaven. I will do this so that my people will come back to me. I will do this so that Egypt will know who the one true God is. And so consistently, it goes out there as the reason miracles occur is so that God's glory can be exhibited, okay? Miracles also do occur to relieve suffering, but will then draw attention to God in with it. But it seems to be that the primary reason is that, is this a moment where where God's glory can be revealed? And there's another angle to that we can talk about a little bit later, which is about if there's a tension between sort of miraculous deliverance and enduring suffering and how that works in that glory to God tension. So C.S. Lewis says in his book, Miracles, he says, if we hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural, we will always say there are no miracles. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. So part of it is, if I believe that something miraculous can happen, then there is benefit to me seeing the miraculous. But if I don't believe the miraculous can happen, will a miracle prove anything? And that's really one of the fascinating questions about miracles. John 2:11, the first of his signs Jesus did this is when he turns the water into wine. Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glories. The disciples believed in him. So he does the miracle at Canaan, which benefits the couple, but the purpose was to get the disciples to believe in him. And so that purpose is really, will this intervention, and I like that you use that word, will this intervention into space and time really, and into the natural universe, will it draw people in?
So there's a passage in the Gospels where it refers to Jesus going to a town, and it says something like he could perform not very many miracles there.
Right, yeah.
And it seems to be tied to like this aspect of faith. Is that kind of what you were saying about like...
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because then it's like, okay, well, that story where he says he could not do this because the people in that town had no faith. So is the way interpreting that passage saying, okay, their lack of faith limited Jesus from performing miracles, which that to me is a very problematic interpretation. To think that anything that I could do could limit God is very problematic. Or is it the miracle, and this sounds weird to say, but I think if you really think about human nature and worldview composition and how people see the world, the miracle just wouldn't have done any good, because miracles aren't magic tricks to entertain us.
Yeah.
They're divine interventions of God to get humanity to pay attention to him and to wake up and to see who he really is and how he is. And so if we are, and I don't want to sound like callous, I really don't, but if I'm sitting there saying, God, I really need a miracle, really, you don't believe that God could handle this in any other way.
Yeah.
And so you need him to demonstrate on whose behalf now? Who's he coming through for?
So yeah, there's a couple things there, right? So a great example of this would be the three men in the story in Daniel's account, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where they say, we believe that God can deliver us from this fiery furnace.
So they believe in the miracle.
Yep. And they believe in the supremacy of God above Nebuchadnezzar's, tyrannical order of worship me, this idol. And then they say, nevertheless, like even if God doesn't actually perform and come through with this miracle, we'll never bow down to you. We'll always worship.
And he's still God. So regardless of the outcome, whether it's miraculous or we suffer, God will still essentially be glorified in this moment.
Yeah.
And that's such a next level a next level confidence, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of faith we should all not like we should have, but certainly aspire to have, because all of us will come face to face with tragedy and difficult situations that we'll find ourselves reading about the God of the Bible who can split the Red Sea, that Jesus has power over death itself, and like, well, that would be really nice to have right now in my life. And for whatever reason, and in some cases he answers that, in other cases he doesn't.
Right.
And so how do we make sense of when he doesn't come through with that?
So I think the way that I put it in my notes is this idea that God performs miracles and manifests his power when he knows it will draw people to his love, his authority, or his compassion. So I think, I look at, like, for example, in we talk about this in the first season. If you go back and catch the episode on the theology of big things, that moonshot one that we did with Pastor Troy, and that prayer that Elijah prays when he says, at the end of it, he says, "Do all these things," and he says, "Answer me, answer me." He says, "That you are God in Israel. Answer me, that these people may know you, that you, Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." In other words, he says, do this incredible thing where he brings the fire down and he destroys the sacrifice that's been soaked in water. Do this so that people will know. Elijah wasn't even saying, bail me out, okay? So I had a teacher in 7th grade, my social studies teacher, Miss Manfredini, and she would say, as we were taking our social studies test, she would stand up and she would say, okay, if you don't know the answer, you need to sit back in your chair, look up, stare at the ceiling, and pray that God will write the answer on the ceiling. Okay, so that never happened, right? Obviously.
Yeah. No, I think it did. It's written right next to the word gullible.
Yeah. But it's funny because that to me is how a lot of people treat miracles. They're bailout plans. God, I have gotten myself into this situation and I need you to. Now, I'm talking about the bailout miracle. I'm not talking about the miracle to alleviate massive suffering or anything like that. But what all of those have in common are, what is my actual resignation to trusting in the power and the sovereignty of God? Okay?
Yeah.
In other words, when I pray to God for something, and I do, I pray for miracles. I pray for healing.
Yeah.
I pray for miraculous provision. I pray for miracles in other people's lives. I pray for them, and I believe that God can and will do things. That should be driven, hopefully, in my life at least, but God, ultimately, that prayer of the Lord's Prayer, on earth that your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will. Whose will is driving this need and this want? And so I think there's a tension that comes with the miraculous that's often not reconciled. We sometimes want just either we want a bailout or we want a parlor trick, right? So man, if God would just crack the heavens open and show up, if God would, help someone walk on water today, I would believe.
Yeah.
And the question is, would you?
Right.
Yeah.
atheists often, like, very famous atheists will use that well, if God exists, why wouldn't he just, speak to me with, from the heavens, thunderous voice? And, usually in debates that I hear this, and then the theist on the other side, the Christian on the other side, was like, well, what a strange apparition or a strange dream I just had.
Yeah.
Like, is how we would rationalize.
Right. We would rationalize in our especially in the modern world, we would just rationalize everything today. Everything
it was a
away.
drone show of lighting.
Yeah. We would say, it must have been, nothing but a wisp of clouds or something like that. We would always find a way, in the same way that the people in that town where Jesus really would not do miracles.
Yeah.
The faith, in other words, the trust that this would be a divine thing, if that's not even there, if there is no desire or capacity to truly see or know God evidenced, then the miracle essentially is, at that point, it is just kind of a parlor trick. And there's some other things we can get into later, but we have seen tons of miracles already in human history. And the people who would say, oh, well, if God would just show me a miracle, he has all throughout human history. We just don't accept the evidence of those miracles. We explain those away. We had this happen in one of our shorts that we play, on our different social media feeds. And it was me talking about, it was from a sermon I preached. It was me talking about, what more evidence do you need? God has already shown himself in Christ. And the comment was, says God has given the evidence and then points back to something that can't be proved. So that was the comment. I'm like, oh, that guy owned me, but that's fine. We love the comments. Please comment right now.
Comment the most snarkiest.
No, don't
Reddit.
Yeah.
Reddit guy post right now.
Yes. But what that shows, though, is, and if I could talk to user whatever his name was, I think that the honest answer would be, so what you're saying is you say you want evidence, I provide evidence, then you dismiss the evidence.
Right.
At what point, that's not effective. I understand why you wouldn't want to, I understand your objections to the evidence, but ultimately these miracles are real, they are tangible, they're recorded, but you don't trust the sources, you don't trust the recording of it, you don't trust whatever. And so the miracle doesn't really do any good until you yourself experience or until you yourself have something that happens in your thought process.
Yeah, and then you can always go to the argument that, well, this is the Matrix or this is a simulation, and so therefore...
I don't think anybody's really going to that argument.
Have you seen that movie?
Yeah, The Matrix?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm familiar with The Matrix.
Well, not everyone has, seen that movie.
If they're 12, they haven't seen it.
Then they shouldn't. And
if you're 12, you shouldn't see it. No, there is no spoon.
You don't think, exactly.
Right,
you don't think people think like that? People say it all the time that we're living in a simulation, especially when you get to the very miraculous things, like we talk about how the measures of the universe are set, the atomic,
atomic weights and the speed of light. Yeah.
Yeah. If anything was just a little bit off. So it's the counter to the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah. So that comes up. We can talk about it now. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, whenever you want.
Which is you're the one who asks questions.
That's right. I do ask questions.
But how does a miracle? So there's a crazy one, right? In the Old Testament, there's a couple times where the sun stops.
Yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah, and if you look at it from all the natural laws of the universe, right? There's one where the sun stops, and the other one where it goes backwards, a la the first Superman movie. Right, where he spins the world backwards and goes back in time. Allah, like a la mode,
okay.
An example
that
of.
You're invoking.
No. What? Okay. Okay. So Superman. Okay. Which I do, by the way, I believe in science. I trust the scientific process. I'm not like an anti-science person. Which is a whole other conversation. If you've ever seen that house on Capitol Hill when you're going on I-5 north. Okay, anyway, there's this house. It says science is God. And I'm like, that's the most unscientific statement I've ever seen, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. Okay, if that happened, the universe should have completely spun out of control, right? For the sun to go backwards or the sun to stand still. At any point, everything should have gone wrong, right? The reason why miracles can work within the natural cause and effect is because all of those things that we talk about, the weight of the atom, those are all the pull of gravity, all the things that would have caused the universe to fall apart, they are all within the sequence of cause and effect. One thing affects another, one thing affects another. But if God himself is the only cause of that event, then he doesn't disrupt that chain of cause and effect. He doesn't blow it up. He inserts himself into it and causes. So there's still a chain of cause and effect that allows the universe to stay together, but it's just simply because God is the causer, not an atom bouncing off of a proton, which bounces off of a molecule, which bounces off of and bounces off of. So it's kind of an interesting one. It's also another way to think of, hey, if a God is powerful enough to actually stop the sun from moving, he's probably powerful enough to make sure everything else is okay. That's the other part of it.
Sure, yeah. That makes sense.
That's the other side of it too. So don't get hung up on that kind of stuff. But that's what happens, is people will say it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just natural. And I didn't see it. I didn't experience it. It's a very old story. How do I know it's real? How can I trust it? There's all sorts of scientific proofs on why it could be trusted, but ultimately, if you're not going to trust it at all, then will any proof help you?
Right. And that's maybe the point I was driving at, is that once, like, even if you're face to face with something miraculously, like, don't be so confident that you would, trust that thing that you even trust your own eyes, right? There are times where people have these bizarre experiences, and the moment they feel like it's really real, and then afterwards they're like, did I even really see that? And they can almost convince themselves out of it. And so at the end of the day, I think, whether it's belief in God or belief that something miraculously happened, there's an element of faith that's associated with it that you have to put your faith out there.
You have to take that step and make a decision about how you're going to frame this.
Yeah.
And so, because that is what you're in control of.
Right.
So we talk a lot about worldview on the show and the components of worldview. At some point, you have to say, my ideas, my feelings, and experiences, I'm going to then choose to say, I allow for this reality, or I don't allow for this reality. That's actually one of the biggest questions you can really fundamentally ask. Is there anything else? I think that's how we phrase it in some of the opening episodes of the show. Is there anything else out there? If the answer is no, then there is no miracle really that could necessarily disrupt that potentially. If the answer is there could be anything, now you've opened your eyes up and you've opened yourself up to the potential that there's more. The line from Shakespeare I quote all the time, that there's more in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophies, that there's more out there. And if I open myself up to that, then maybe I could be open to it. So I'll give you an example from my own life. When I was 2, this is the story that's been passed on to me.
Okay,
so I don't remember.
You remember?
No.
That's quite impressive.
So I was around 2, and up into 2, I hadn't walked or talked at all. I was really behind developmentally.
And now you're a podcaster.
And okay. So, and my parents had started to be taking me in for tests, and they'd done a battery of tests, and essentially there was a diagnosis of cerebral palsy.
Oh, wow.
That it was looking like I had cerebral palsy. So my parents did what Pentecostal Christians did in 1975. You went to prayer meeting at church and they prayed. And the story, the lore, the legend, I don't know, but the family story is that within the next few days, I both said my first word and took my first step.
Wow.
Okay? So as a rational human being, okay, I have 2 options for that story. I can say, well, I have 3 actually. One is that's not what happened at all. Come on, guys. Okay, so there's that. But I like my mom and dad, and I trust them, so I'm not. Option 3 is not on the table.
Yeah.
One is, things finally kicked in, and it just happened to be in proximity to the prayer. That's a completely rational explanation.
Yeah.
Or God did something. God healed me. And for some reason, God healed me, but then I think of this young man that was a part of our church when we were living in Alabama, who was not healed. And he was living at that time, this young, I want to say he was probably preteen boy with cerebral palsy. So I have to sit there and say there's a reason that God healed me, but doesn't heal him. And here I am pastoring, preaching, doing all that stuff, talking about God's power and God's healing and all that kind of stuff. And this young man's in the crowd. I have to have a faith system that either says it's random and accident and sorry, or I have to say there's a driving purpose behind both of these. And whatever that is, I have to trust that God's sovereign over both of them.
Yeah, some might even say, well, God's cruel for
Yeah.
allowing, one but not the other.
Right. Yeah.
And and we have to be able to rationalize. Exactly. Our faith system has to be able to rationalize there's a purpose for it. And I think I'm almost it's not that I'm saying that there isn't, a way of describing it and where this happens because God's able to use this for his glory and this maybe not so much. But I'm also really comfortable with the idea of like, God works in mysterious ways,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because I can almost, once I know that there's like, oh, I got to game the system a little bit.
Right, yeah.
I can get my miracle. God, if I'll just promise to like talk about it more,
Right, yeah.
and share about,
Yeah.
like that. Because then what happens to me is I start thinking about, okay, what can I do to make that scenario be where I'm appeasing God?
Yeah. How can I maximize my potential for miracle?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So, and we've talked about this a couple different times, but like, one of the faith traditions I've had growing up was that believed a lot about like faith and victory and,
Yeah.
and kind of prosperity gospel a little bit. And I remember when Sarah and I went through something very tragic, and like there's a decision to be made, and that in the back of my mind is like, is it my faith, right? Like if I just had faith, like it's
Right.
like me in control of this uncontrollable thing, and it created a lot of anxiousness and there's a question mark of whether we could not go through with the doctors and intervention,
Yeah.
just believe that God's going to come,
Right.
which would have been a tremendous risk to my wife at the
Right,
time.
yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
I'm, it's important, I think, to have this kind of discussion about like faith, because there are many people that take that to that extreme. That it's because of my faith that I can influence whether a miracle happens
Yes.
or not.
Yes.
And people teach that too.
Very much so.
And that's
If you don't have your miracle, it's because you haven't done something right, or you haven't prayed almost a right formula, which
Right.
the formula resulting in miracle approach is essentially magic. It's
Yes.
it's what the Bible would call witchcraft. So I'm very, very suspicious of that kind of conversation.
Well, and not even that, but that too.
Yeah.
But also the disciples believed that was kind of why
Right.
the other guy who you said was, I think it was the blind guy.
Right, yeah.
Like Jesus. Why is this guy blind? Was it his parents who sinned?
Right.
Or was
what
it
he who sinned? Even though he was born blind.
Born blind, right. So he somehow sinned before
which
being
is ridiculous.
born.
But that is that mentality that there's either something wrong with me
Yeah.
that equated to my suffering, or there's something wrong with me that I can't receive a miraculous deliverance for my suffering.
Yeah.
Which the inverse of that is then that the people who are prosperous or do receive miraculous intervention from their suffering or from their situation, they are better
Right.
than me. And what that does is that places all of that sovereignty and all of that power and all that, it places it squarely on us, that we are the deciding factor of the miraculous, that we are the thing. And that is just simply not how the universe works.
Right.
That God sovereignly and divinely chooses when and how he moves, and I either trust that or I don't. Now, I can struggle with the trust, and I do. There have been plenty of times where I've said, "Dear God, please come through.
Yeah.
Dear God, please make something happen. Dear God, please step in." Okay? So I'm allowed to do that, and I have done that. But ultimately, I have to ask myself, am I sitting in this sovereign trust? There's a story in, I want to make sure I have the right story, but in John again, and by the way, John's a great book for this kind of study, because all of John's miracles aren't actually the word miracle, they're the word sign. And so whenever Jesus does anything in John, it's a sign, which I think is a great way of understanding miracles. So yeah.
It's the bread and the fish.
No, I want to make sure I get it right. Anyway. Well, that's when he says, it's essentially, the world won't see. Isaiah says they've been blinded and I can't see. But let's just take that whole mess out. But there was a very specific story that I wanted to.
I think, can we just isolate the
Yeah, probably too. Yeah. No, it's, why am I not finding? Oh, there it is. Okay. So the way I put it in my notes is this. He does these things to remind us of his power and his love for us. And there's a story, it's in Luke 5, and this is the story of when Jesus is teaching in a home and the friends bring the guy in who's paralyzed and they break the roof open and they drop him down, okay? Mm-hmm. And Jesus looks at the guy and he says, your sins are forgiven.
Yeah.
And everyone loses their minds. And then he says, what? You think it's more impressive?
Which is easier, right?
Which is easier, to forgive his sins or to heal him? He says, fine, take up your mat and walk. So you have this thing where Jesus, they brought this guy in, and Jesus says the greatest miracle, the greatest thing in this guy's life that needs to happen is not his physical healing.
Yeah.
He is spiritually destroyed. He is spiritually torn. He is spiritually infirm, and I'm going to heal that. But our human nature isn't impressed by that. It's not drawn to that miracle because we can't what? See it or observe it. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus says, okay, I will kind of give you also what you need, because his healing of the man's physical ailment then validated his spiritual authority. But Jesus was wanting to lead with that spiritual authority. Mm-hmm. Trust in my spiritual authority, not in the things you think I can do for you.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty compelling story, I think, because that is an example of Jesus doing both in the same moment. His mission, which is to save and to forgive and to reconcile people to God. But look what was first. The mission was first before the activity of the miraculous healing, before the cool stuff, I guess. And so that to me is a pretty interesting story about that.
Yeah, and ultimately we believe that God will restore all things. Mm-hmm. So, it's right for people to look at the paralyzed man and be like, hold on, nothing happened. Like, where his sins didn't dissipate or whatever. Like, what do you mean he's forgiven? Like, that's almost a platitude, from the outsider's perspective.
Right, yeah.
Not obviously Jesus is meaning that he's forgiving him and that there's a fulfillment in that in the cross and everything. But when we see things and we know that they ought not to be that way.
Right. Yeah. So the idea that ultimately, that's actually really good, because ultimately, if we look at the miraculous from sort of this eschatological end times point of view, we know that Jesus, right? It's number 3. Jesus fixes it. God made it. We broke it. Jesus fixes it. The church shares it. So Jesus fixes it. And in the last days, in the great eternal day of God, in the great kingdom of God, all things will be restored. So anything that's miraculous is a precursor of that ultimate restoration, the ultimate form of justice, what N.T. Wright calls the joy of making things right. So this ultimate renewal, this ultimate restoration, we tap into that and it comes back and it is affected in the immediate here and now to draw attention and glory to the name of God. So if I'm praying for a situation and I'm praying for a miracle, that model of prayer comes through pretty well, because I think if I can say, God, I do believe in you. God, I trust you. You see what I need. You see what I want. And let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That prayer, by the way, is always answered. The prayer that you can always have answered is your will be done. Mm. God, I want your will done in my life, which has to make me think that there is a scenario in which, and I know this is difficult to hear, and I've had to endure this, and I've said it out loud in sermons before, and I think I'm intellectually 1,000% and emotionally 15% there. Because although I agree with what I'm about to say, I don't always feel good about it. But there is a reality in which my suffering can bring more glory to God than the miracle to relieve it. And I don't even like saying that out loud. Like, I'm just like, oh, it's something, like there's enough still superstition in me to think that I just jinx it or something like that.
Yeah.
But when you read the Gospels, and especially when you read Paul, and Paul is saying, these things happened to me so that I can share the gospel with you. He's not talking about, I got a great new car and I got a great interest rate on my house and my kids got into the best school. He's talking about being beaten. He's talking about being stoned. He's talking about being kicked out of cities. He's talking about starving. He's talking about being thrown into jail. And he says, my suffering has done more to advance the gospel, essentially, than if I had not suffered at all. And that's such a next level of Christianity. I'm just going to tell everyone I'm nowhere near that. I feel like I need to be really vulnerable and honest. But when I go into a situation and I say, God, I'm hurting, God, I'm suffering, I'm scared, I'm frightened, I have a lot of anxiety, I do have anxiety issues, I have all sorts of things going on in my life, God, I need to know this. If I can get to a place of peace that says, whether through miracle or through perseverance, you will deliver me from this. And I just want the thing that's going to show you in my life and in the lives of people around me.
Yeah. And that's the thing that makes us, it gives us a tremendous amount of commonality, empathy with others, because you can only imagine a scenario as much as you have the ability to creatively think through something, but to actually experience it is completely different. And so when you endure suffering that you pray, God, take it away from me, and he doesn't. One of the things that if you do that prayer you mentioned, like, Lord, let your will be done in my life, he can use that suffering to soften your heart and embrace others who have experienced the exact same thing as you have. Whereas you may not have been able to go to that deep. And I think that's one of the things that we love about Jesus, right? Jesus was tried in all things, right? He is not, we do not have a high priest that cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, right?
With our infirmities,
So Jesus is, that's another glorious thing about him, that it's not like God is just, sorry, tut champ, like he actually came through the universe and became a man and was tried in all things. And so all the things that we, in all ways that we have suffered, we have the God of the universe who has suffered in the exact same way. And he knows that, and he's able to, he can do all things. I'm not saying he needed to do that in order to have that, but we can have this trust in him that he's able to, that as we're, in the midst of our suffering and our pain, that there's a God who experienced the exact same thing, and he's right there with us.
Yes, and I think a big part of that is, that what greater miracle will there ever be than the incarnation, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ? So every other miracle that happens in the Bible, even the really wild stuff, the Red Sea parting, or if you count the plagues as miraculous interventions, the plagues, or the sun standing still, or even going backwards, like the really, really big ticket stuff, right? Which again, how many of those are there? If you don't count the plagues, you're talking 3 or 4 legitimate, cosmically shifting realities, right? What of any of those tops the God of the universe incarnating himself, suffering? And look at what they say on the cross. If you're really God, perform a miracle.
Yeah.
If you're really God, take yourself off the cross. And even Christ refused to do that because he knew his suffering would accomplish more than the miracle of him ripping himself off the cross and conquering.
Yeah.
Because on the other side of that cross was the miracle, the resurrection. And that is the miracle that leads to all miracles. That is the miracle that opens up every single miracle backwards and forwards. But he has to suffer in order for a miracle to occur. And what thing draws the most attention to Jesus to this day? It's not the resurrection. It's still the cross. The symbol of Christianity, whether a crucifix or a cross, is still that symbol. The symbol that people who aren't even of faith can look at and recognize is not an empty tomb, it's an empty cross. It's this idea that it's the suffering of Jesus that has drawn the most attention to Jesus, not necessarily his miracles. And so if I want to see God at most in my life, then my prayer is, whether through miraculous intervention, through the wisdom of figuring this situation out, or through the perseverance of this. I know from 1 Corinthians you're going to get me through it. You've already made that promise. But how you get me through that promise, God, I guess I'm saying I have to trust you, that you know the best way. Who will I be on the other side of this miracle? Or who will I be on the other side of this suffering. You know, if we think of a miracle as a way to get God's attention, well, again, not to overquote C.S. Lewis, but he says suffering is God's great megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Yeah.
Right? God, we have to start paying attention to God. And honestly, I'd love my life to be in such a way where I'm so aware of God, I don't need either. Like I'm good on either. I'm fine. Thank you. You know, but if I need it or I endure it, suffering, miracles don't necessarily mean I'm more spiritual, and suffering doesn't mean I'm worse.
Yeah.
And that mentality is we find it in the Bible, and it always gets corrected. When people bring that sort of mentality up in the Bible, and we still see it in different religious traditions today.
So karma,
and it has to be corrected. Karma.
Right.
Yeah, you get what's coming to you. Yeah.
You know, and the disciples they'd be quoting the Old Testament when it came to like that mindset. Like, if you follow the law, blessed will you be in the country, blessed you'll be in the city. And if you do not follow, then cursed will you. So like, it's not as if they invented it, or it's just, it's a very human, and it seems as if, you know, it's a poor reading of Deuteronomy.
Yeah, but even in that if-then sequence, right? Even in that cause and effect sequence, here's the natural laws, the natural spiritual laws playing out. If you do this, then this happens. Those are all natural spiritual laws. Where are most of the miracles of the Bible found? In the Old Testament, right? So in this if-then sequence of events, God still moved within that because he is the cause. Everything else, if then, is a sequence. It's a chain that he sets up that sort of runs, but he is constantly working in that. He gave it, he started it, and then he jumps in and superintends the whole thing. So even in all of that, he's still working and doing amazing things.
So, I mean, in going into the next section of this, so we see all these miracles, and we've talked about, okay, the resurrection is the biggest one, all these things. We've kind of assumed that he still works today, but to many, it appears as if there aren't any more miracles today. And some might even say that they've ceased. Yeah. Right? And so what evidence is there, or how should we view that? Are there miracles still happening today?
Well, I think the answer is yes. So let me just say that. And I think the evidence is as tangible as the evidence of the miracles of the Bible. You hear about them. Can I prove them? Can I define them? I don't know. I've experienced what I would say probably in my life, I've experienced at least two things in my life. There's one story I told, and then there's another story where I would say it felt miraculous. It felt that there was no other explanation. I couldn't. And I am not, I'm a reason-based person.
Man of science.
I wouldn't say I'm a man of science, but you get where I'm going. So there's that. There's nothing really conclusively in the Bible that says, and then they stopped, okay? But one thing that was interesting to me as I was looking at this is, why don't we see more? Okay, more compared to what? So depending on how you view the timelines in the Bible, you're anywhere from like 12,000 to 6,000 years of recorded history in the Bible, okay? Depending on how you play with the numbers in the Bible, right? Within that time frame, if you count the 10 commandments, or the 10 plagues, by the way, as individual ones, there are about 160, 170 miracles in the Bible, okay, that are recorded, okay? So we forget that those 170 miracles are spaced out over 12,000 years of recorded history, that they weren't everyday occurrences. It's one of the problems and mistakes we make when we read the Gospels. We forget that the Gospels stretch over 3 years, at minimum, 3 years of Jesus' ministry. Most of them only focus on like days or weeks at a time, so it looks like everything's like, oh, he went there and boom, and then boom, and then boom. But that was even...
Well, that's how Mark writes it.
Right. Mark,
immediately
immediately. And it's like, oh, okay, but pretty quickly.
All right, Mark.
So we think that these things are just like every day. It was like miracle here. And then John doesn't help the case by saying at the end of John, he's like, and there are so many miracles done
I was going to say that
there a whole library of books couldn't contain them.
So it was every day, wasn't it?
Right. So when you look at, okay, so we're talking now, human history, recorded human history of, 20, let's say 10,000 years, because I don't want to get everyone freaked out, of recorded human history, okay? Billions of people who have lived. I mean, there's nothing, it seems weird, but there's nothing measurable to say that there are any more or less miracles going on in the lives of everyday people today than there were in the Bible. It's just whether or not we want to see them. We want to acknowledge the things that happen in our lives as miracles. We would honestly, for the average person in America today, they would rather see it as coincidence, felicity, luck. The one thing they don't want is providence. Because providence means there is a God. And if there is a God, now everything changes. I'm accountable to that God. I mean that God. So when people say, oh, if I just had a miracle, there's a part of me that really, and I'm not talking about Christians now, people of faith that say I need a miracle. I'm talking about people who say, I need a miracle for proof. And my thing would be, I don't know that you really want miracles. Because what the miracle means is that there's a being not only on the other side of all of this that's powerful enough to do this, but who loves you enough and is concerned about you personally enough to do this. And that's a whole other kettle of fish that I think a lot of people aren't willing. So are there more? Why don't we see more miracles today? I think, number one, do we? There's no way to measure if we see more or less. We're also limiting that also to our Western way of looking at things. If you talk to missionaries from other parts of the world, the miraculous is and the supernatural is very frequent and very outstanding in their testimonies and in the stories they tell. So now you're just minimizing it here. Then going back to our previous discussion, would it do any good? We're in a post-enlightenment scientific age. We can explain everything away.
Oh, we're about to be post-scientific too.
Yeah, but that's neither here nor there.
Another podcast.
But people don't really, if your worldview isn't predisposed to see it, no one believes evidence of anything. Mm-hmm. And so maybe God's just saying, that's not the work I need to do in your life. There are other ways to draw you to me, intellectually or through the experiences of your natural life or through, some sort of ethical or moral way to bring you in. But that supernatural intervention may or may not be as necessary. So for the Christian then, well, why when I pray for miracles, it doesn't seem like God does anything? Well, James actually gives you a great way to look at it. In James 3, he says, in James 4, he says, you desire, you do not have. He says, so you murder, so stop murdering. You covenant and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. So a lot of people say you have not because you ask not. They're like, okay, well, I'll just ask. But then James says, you ask and you don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. Now, I'm not going to hammer this as the way James does. I want to pull it back a little bit. But he says, one of the reasons maybe is I haven't really asked the question, why do I want this miracle? Not why do I need it? Why do I want this miracle? Why is this miracle necessary for me? And I want to be very careful because I'm not talking about, are you saying, Brian, we shouldn't pray? No. Pray, pray, pray. Just like those men in the fiery furnace. Our God will deliver us, and pray with that faith and pray with that heart and pray with that belief. And if he doesn't, he's still God, essentially. We're going to be delivered either way. And so, and I want to say that with all the sympathy of people enduring suffering that I can't even imagine, that I have been, for God's providence, not forced to endure. That's why I'm saying it's not an emotionally satisfying answer. I wish I could say something. But in terms of the realm of theology, I have to say, God, not my will, but your will. And then even the hard stuff, which we've all had to endure, realizing that the hard stuff that God wanted for us, was ultimately the best thing for us.
Yeah, I think actually it is a very emotionally satisfying answer that in his providence, he allowed this, and it's not knowable, and that's okay. And surrendering that, because we aren't meant to know everything. And in one day, when we're with him for eternity, he can reveal those things to us. But many times throughout biblical and human history, God's very comfortable with not painting the full picture and keeping part hidden. I think in Proverbs it says something, the glory of man is to reveal things, but the glory of God is to keep things hidden. Something like that. Yeah. And it's I have found peace and freedom in acknowledging that there's some things that I just don't know, and I'll be okay with that. And at some point he'll answer that.
For me, it often always comes back to like an old gospel song or a gospel hymn. And I think of by and by when the morning comes, by and by when all the saints of God are gathered home. We will tell the story of how we overcome, and then we will understand it better by and by. We will understand it better by and by. It will be worth it all when we see Jesus. And I think if we can hold on to that in moments, and I say this just thinking of, I don't know, the privilege that I have to sit here in this podcast studio and say that, I recognize that, and my heart can still break for suffering and weep for suffering and pray that God would mitigate suffering through miraculous ways. But maybe sometimes we use the miraculous as a way to not engage and say, I need to be God's solution in this situation. Maybe change in my life, or I need to be involved somewhere, or something where I can actually be God's solution. So it's a heavy subject. It's kind of a light, silly question that Bible college students ask to try and sound really impressive. But when you get into the mechanics of it, it brings up a lot of core theological issues about sovereignty, about the role of suffering, the role of God's power, God's own will and the mystery of his will. It really does touch on some of those big ticket questions.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap up here then. Well, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Please take a second to like and subscribe, and click that bell if you're on YouTube for notifications. Make sure to leave a 5-star review on your podcast app, so it helps the algorithmic bears eat this podcast up, and your friends and family can find us. You can share with friends. A good conversation today. Thank you, Dr. Brian.
Thank you, Pastor Matt.